So I am a penetration tester from Red Siege, and let's get into this. We're going to be covering how to get the most out of your web application pen test. But before we begin, who am I? So my name is Briley. I'm a penetration tester from Red Siege. We do pretty much anything offensive that you can think of. I like to specialize in web applications. I have about 15 years of experience total. Of that, I was in the military, I worked in the healthcare industry, and I was a consultant for the last 6 years. Obviously, I'm a web app lover. I wouldn't be up here talking to you about web apps unless I hated them. And I am a Raspberry Pi and Arduino lover. I think that a lot of the motivations and a lot of the experience that you have doing web apps melds really well with Raspberry Pis. You have to be experimenting, you have to be testing things. So obviously, if you're a big old nerd in your professional life, you're probably a big old nerd in your private life. I am a big Battletech MechWarrior enthusiast. I am a Rock Gnome Barbarian. That is a very fun class and race to play. Highly recommend it. And I am a FromSoft apologist. For those of you who don't know what FromSoft is, it's Dark Souls, it's Elden Ring, it's any of those games that are really tedious. Let's try to fix that. There we go. So I broke my presentation into 3 main parts. The first part is going to be about before the test. We're going to spend most of the time, I'm going to spend most of my time speaking in there. I'm sorry, my mic keeps on falling off. The next part is going to be during the test and finally after the test. So as I said, I was in the I was active duty Air Force for 6 years. Thank you. And there's a bunch of things that I learned. One of the things that I took away the most was that your day-to-day objectives should be that you need to be setting yourself up and others for success. And by doing that, one of the best ways to start that is communication. So, big surprise, communication. I used to really dislike when like C-levels or people that are giving talks would be like, oh, communication's the most important thing. Like, I get it, man, you're trying to pad out 5 minutes of your talk. But after doing this for like 15 years, it's so true. Communication is one of the most critical aspects to having a successful pen test. So from my experience in the military and just being a consultant, almost every major issue has stemmed from communication. It'll be people not understanding what the scope is. It'll be people not understanding what is and isn't allowed, or what the client is looking for and what our capabilities as testers are. And then pretty much effective communication will help us define the scope. It'll help us define the rules of engagement, which in the end, ideally will give us a good report for you to review, and everybody will come away with something more high value than what we started with. And one of the things I say is key to communication is instant communication channels need to be set up. I'm talking Slack, I'm talking Discord, I am talking Signal, I am talking smoke signals. Pretty much anything besides, oh my God, anything besides email. Email just sits there. I like to call that communication at rest, and I want communication in transit. I want something that I can communicate with you guys instantly. So one half of communication is talking, the other is listening. So you need to understand what's being said, and one of the few things, or one of the 3 major things I like to say is that you need to ask and explain pain points of your application. So for example, and we'll go into this a little bit in detail a little bit later, but white whale versus gray whale hunting, I promise you that'll make sense later. And then having the client explain the tendencies or pain points of your application, because that will explain like, okay, what frameworks are we using? What technologies are being used? For example, I've had clients that are like, okay, we do everything on the cloud and we do everything on we use JavaScript, and that, it makes sense in a cloud environment because you're trying to push off as much functionality onto the browser so you don't get charged for it. But me as a tester, what that tells me in that one sentence is like, well, they might be pushing certain functionality off onto the browser that really you shouldn't be doing. You should be having that information sent to the back end and just eating that additional cost, so I can start looking into that. One of the other things I always say is that you as a tester or you as the client, you need to explain where value is added. Sometimes testers will say, hey, we'll test your WAF, but we're only going to spend a day on it. And there is value in having your WAF tested, but if we spend a whole week, 2 weeks on your WAF testing that, we tested your WAF. We didn't actually test your web application. So explaining where you can add value is critical before you even start the test. And then finally, I am a visual creature. I like seeing things. I like playing with things. And so I always ask for a demo of the app. I am always thrilled when a client just gives me a demo of the app, because the intent of the application might not be known at the time, and then having the developer walk me through the app, it shows me like where they spent most of the time writing their code. It shows me where they spent most of their time developing, and so that's probably where I'm going to spend most of my time testing. And then, on top of that, I only get to spend a week, sometimes 2 weeks at most, on your application. The intent of your application might not be readily apparent, so having you show me how to use the application, how it's intended to be used, is vital for my understanding of the application. So what we've been talking about pretty much is how you define the scope. Scoping, especially for web apps nowadays, is getting really, really, really complicated, and it's getting really, really tricky to do. In the advent of the cloud, everybody has a different service that handles auths. Everything on the screen over here is things I've witnessed or experienced firsthand while giving the application test. I did a API test where they said, oh yeah, our API is built on top of another API that we don't own, and then based on what parameters that you use, our server on the background is going to send that data forward with a different API. And I'm like, how do you even test that without going out of scope? And especially with web applications, I think one of the bullets that we just have to bite is that you are going to go out of scope a little bit, but you should be doing light testing to understand what that's going to entail, and then move on from there. So one of the main things I like to communicate is that understand that the scoping is going to be tricky. I've had experiences where the authentication for the application is handled off the site, or it's handled by a different vendor, and we might not be able to test that. Or I've had, we've only, the file uploads is a great example. Me as a malicious actor, I'm going to essentially try to find a way to upload malicious files, and if I can, and I can use your good domain, that's awesome. I can now share malware everywhere, and that file upload might be in scope, but the storage might not be in scope, and that's a communication, that is a talk that we need to have before the test even starts, and then even during the test. So the next few slides are just quick tips I've noticed. Staging versus prod, I'm going to be really simple about this. Just say no to testing and prod. I've never seen it work out well. It's usually not worth it. I've also seen the next thing twice, and it's both ended very poorly twice. You have a staging environment, but it's backed by a SQL production database. That has ended poorly for the 2 times I've seen that. That's just testing in prod with extra steps. Do not do that. And the reason you want to test in staging is that you have the ability to revert. So let's say I do something really dumb, destroy the app. You can usually flip a switch and then get access, revert everything, and then I can continue my test without any production downtime. The nice thing too is if you want to watch alerts and you want to watch me do what I do, you can, and you can focus on those alerts specifically without having to without missing out the important alerts on your production machines. And then finally, and I said this before, but test data. I can be a lot more aggressive with test data, but if I'm in a production environment, I have to be way more gentle because I don't want you to lose data. I don't want you to lose, production hours. I don't want you to lose revenue. But with a staging environment, I can be way, way more aggressive, and you'll get more value out of your pen test if I'm allowed to be more aggressive and save time. But ultimately, what you need to do is that the staging needs to reflect production. And ideally, if we have a staging environment, I would like my own staging environment, because when we're doing web application testing, we as testers, we're looking for logic errors. We're looking for how the app reacts and changes as we give input. If there's a developer in that staging environment too, and that changes things, that's going to make it way harder for me to test. So if we have a staging environment that's just for the tester and it reflects production, I'm totally happy. So user roles, this is another one. There's not really a good answer for this. It's going to depend on the app. Typically, what I recommend is that if you are going to be active and communicating with me back and forth, I can get away with 2 basic user roles or 2 roles that you want me to look at. But let's say that you're not going to be able to support that, or you're not going to be able to answer all my Twilight questions. Then give me an administrator user too, so that way I can create roles, I can create users, I can look at data and values on the back end and understand how that application works. The other thing I usually typically say is that I don't want any super admins. I've had a soon breach test I've done before where they gave me a DA and they're like, well, what can you do with a DA? And I was like, well, everything. It's a DA account. Same thing with web applications. I don't want the server admin. I don't want the hosting admin. I just need a basic 1 or 2 users to go back and forth to look for IDORs. All right, so this is my favorite one, and this is also a highly, highly contested topic. Should code be provided? I am incredibly nosy. That is just the definition of being a pen tester. You are incredibly nosy. So I am always like, yes, give me code, give me code, give me code. Now I need you to understand that if you give me code, I'm not going to do a true code review. It's a cheat sheet for me. I'm not going to give you big O, little o recommendations. I'm not going to say, oh, the way that this is tied into this application, I'm not going to do that. I'm using that to fast forward my learning of your application. So the nice thing is most modern web apps use something called MVC. MVC is Model Controller View. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about that, but me as a tester, one of the first things, if I get code, I'm going to look at the models, and I'm going to look at the controllers. And if I can find a folder that's called controllers or model, that's going to save me so much time, because now I can start understanding, like, okay, these are the functions, these are the data sets, these are the objects that your application uses. How do they interact with the controllers? Instead of me, blindly clicking on different inputs, different parameters, different headers, and trying to figure out how those all interact. I can just look at the code directly. And the nice thing is that this helps us find edge cases faster. So for example, I did a web app recently, and they had an allowed list and they had a disallowed list. And I noticed that SVGs on this file upload were not part of the allowed list, and they were not part of the disallowed list. And I was like, oh, that's an interesting edge case. What will happen if I give it something that's not on that? And it denied it, luckily, and that was great, but that really sped up the process for me to find these edge cases a lot quicker. Finally, with anything when you share, there is always risk in sharing code, and what I typically recommend is that we try really, really hard not to get popped as testers, but one of the ways that you can minimize your risk is remove hard-coded credentials from the code. I know that you shouldn't have hard-coded credentials in code. It still happens, but in the event that somebody gets popped, if you remove that, that's going to save you a lot of heartache in the end. And finally, we are all on the same team. And if you've been communicating effectively with your client, or as a client you're communicating effectively with your red team, you will understand, and everybody will come to the same understanding, that we are all on the same team. So any aid that you provide me is going to be more value to your report, your test on the end. And I'll have a couple better examples later on, but I still come into certain tests where they're like, no, I don't want to whitelist you. I don't want to allow list. I don't want to get rid of the WAF. I don't want to provide code. I don't want to do X, Y, and Z. And I was like, man, we only have a week to test at most, and I want you to get the most out of your app. So the more that you work with me, the more that I can do better work for you, and everyone wins. So quick things, because I know I'm probably talking like 60 miles a minute here. Instant communication channels are the best thing you can do. I love having direct access to a developer or the security team so I can bounce questions off of them. Just say no to testing and prod, never pans out. More roles will almost always equal more testing time required. And code is nice. I really love getting code, but it's not required. So testing during the test. I'm going to take a quick water break. Okay, so here's the other fun Ian thing. I am a lover of really weird analogies, and one of the things I'm going to share with you is that most shark attacks happen in near shore water. Okay. And then recently, me and my wife, we bought a house together, go Team Briley, and it has a pool. And like most things I really love, insurance has ruined it for me because I said, because you have a pool, there's an increase of drowning, you have to pay more insurance. And I'm thinking about that, I'm like, well, duh, of course that's the thing, because, you know, the opportunity exists there. Sharks are not coming onto the land to bite humans, you know, they're gonna go where the humans are to eat, right? And so when I'm training new testers, one of the things I say is that you want to be a shark. You want to find where the humans are. You need to test where the code is actually at. And if you're testing some weird function off to the side that, you know, a developer spent maybe 25 lines writing, you're not going to get an effective test where most of the code was written to handle, like, you know, function A, or, you know, we want to make sure the users can access A, B, and C. If you're testing other stuff where the code isn't, the vast majority of the code isn't written, you're not going to find anything, or you're going to find less mistakes. So, as I mentioned before, there is white whale and gray whales, and this is another like really bad analogy that I like using when I'm training new people. So when I'm training new people, I go, okay, there's usually one white whale and there's 50 gray whales, but your job as a tester is that you're a whaler, all right? Blubber is blubber, fat is fat, meat is meat. You don't care the color of the whale, you just need to find these things. And so one example that I always use with new testers, and then, or with clients that I'm trying to understand, like, what is your gray whales versus white whales? This query string over here, there is 51 whales here. There's one white whale and there's 50 gray whales. So if I had effective communication and that the client is saying, oh, we're really worried about other users accessing other users' data, I go, okay, well, query user, that's an interesting parameter. Let's focus on this. Now, the white whale here is that if I can somehow reverse engineer and figure out how the GUID is designed, and I can calculate the exact way that everything is calculated, that is the white whale. And that would be really cool. That would be a career maker, but other information security consultants, they are not the ones paying my paycheck. It's the clients that are paying my paycheck, and they told me explicitly that they're worried about other users accessing other users' data. So I go, okay, it's a GUID. I could probably brute force through that, but that is 16 choose 255. That is a ridiculously huge number. I'm not going to do that. That's not worth your time. It's not worth my time. The gray whales here are, I go to the client with that instant communication. I go, hey, man, it's going to take way too long for me to brute force through all this. Can you provide me like 3 or 4 valid GUIDs so I can just see if this application, this parameter is vulnerable to me just accessing data? That takes at most maybe 3 minutes for them to collect the GUIDs and send it to me, versus me spending like 10 hours, 12 hours, the whole test trying to brute force through all that. And the gray whales, I got way more gray whales off of that query by just asking the question about the application and having them, you know, tell me like, hey, here's 5 valid GUIDs, than me spending the whole week trying to brute force and figure out, oh, hey, you know, I can reverse engineer the GUID to figure out like how it's generated. The real vulnerability here is that this query allows anybody to access other users' data. So, you know, don't be afraid to ask questions about the app, and don't be afraid to tell your testers, hey, go ahead and ask questions. You know, there's nothing wrong with asking questions. So finally, and this is more of like my personal crusade, informational findings. So I hate informational findings. I think that they are the biggest waste of time, and the reason being is that we as web app testers, we're testing logic. We're not doing an SS scan, and we're not doing a software inventory. There's reasons that information might be useful, but realistically, we're trying to abuse logic of the application itself. And me telling you, oh, you have the most up-to-date WordPress site, like that doesn't do any favors to anybody. But what I typically like to do is informational findings, if I have any, is that it is a symptom of something worse, that I think that there's something there and I just ran out of time, or I'm too dumb to figure it out, so maybe have your developers look at it. The other thing that I usually use them for is client-requested findings. So a client says, hey, we're really interested in webcams, and I find webcams, I find a way to interact with it, but there's no way for me to justify a higher severity level. I'll throw it in as an informational finding. But most of the time I find, like, if I'm using informational finding, it's more specifically because the communication that happened before when the client was like, oh, hey, we're interested in X, Y, and Z. I found something that could be used. I just ran out of time. That seems to be more value added for the test, or for the client overall, than me telling you that you have the latest version of WordPress. So after the test. So if you've been doing everything effectively up to this point, you're actively communicating with the developers, the security team, DevOps, whoever, nothing on the report should come as a surprise to them. The worst thing you can ever do is say, oh, hey, we found 5 criticals, and we're telling you the day of while your C-level's in the room. Like, that's just a terrible way to do business. So the report readout, if you're doing everything well, should be the most peaceful part of this whole process. One of the things I noticed that a lot of people don't understand about the report, especially from a client side, is that all severity levels are best guesses. I said this before, we are only allowed in your application to test for maybe a week, 2 weeks at most. So we are making best guesses about the application, we're making best guesses about how the code's working in the background, and there might be a mismatch or a misunderstanding about how this function works, but ultimately the severity levels are just based on our experience. You're allowed to agree or disagree with, like, the severity levels of the app or of the report, but we're just giving you the best guess, the best educated guess that we can about what the severity level is. Some vulnerabilities are more obvious than others, but we're just trying to let you know, like, we think it's a high, we think it's a critical. The other thing that with the report readout that I always explain is that the report and what you do with the report after is your a la carte experience. So you're going to know your own baby best. Your developer's going to know how the app works better, way better than I do. There's only maybe one app that we have with a repeat client that I've done a lot of work for. I've done a lot of code reviews for them. I have maybe an okay understanding on par with their developers, but for the vast majority of our clients, I only get 1 or 2 weeks to spend with it. So you're going to know your own baby best. And all of our findings are just suggestions. They're like, hey, if you can do this, if you can do that. Like, a good example of this is I found a way that you could get patient data and all you needed was an integer. And I was like, okay, the Band-Aid approach to this is my suggestion. Your Band-Aid approach to this is to use GUIDs, because what I said earlier, it takes way more time to brute force through all those GUIDs. It doesn't fix the underlying issue, but at least Band-Aids that. The ultimate fix is to have a relationship between nurse and patient. And if you didn't develop from that for the start, that's going to be a lot of work. And they're like, we can't support that. I'm like, that's fine. Start with the GUIDs, and then as time goes on, try to make that relational, make that relationship between the two objects, the nurse and the patient, and that way you'll have a more secure application instead of somebody getting lucky and guessing a GUID out of the hat. But ultimately, when you're looking at the report, it's your a la carte experience, and sometimes taking action may or may not be better than taking no action, and that's totally fine. These are suggestions for you. You don't have to do that. You don't have to do the most secure thing in the world to have a good application. These are just suggestions for you. So in closing, like I said before, the best thing that you can do is have active communication, back and forth channels between the tester and the DevOps team, the developers, the security team. And the reason being is that if I'm able to ask questions, I'm able to gain a better understanding of that application way faster, and I'm able to do more nuanced attacks, more nuanced research on your application than me trying to brute force and figure out everything in your application. So have active communication and, just ask questions. There's nothing wrong with that. So in closing, where to reach me. I am most active on Discord. My handle is the Ghost of Yankee Jim. There is not a cool story behind it. It is a bunch of random words I threw together that sounded cool. Red Siege's Discord. We have a Discord at redsiege.com/Discord. We'll try to answer your questions as soon as possible. Twitter, X, whatever it's called now. For every one security post that I have, there's about 50 memes. So if you're not into memes, don't follow me on Twitter. And if you want to reach me out on email, my least favorite type of communication, the communication at rest, if you will, ian@redsiege.com. Do we have any questions? And I'm going to try to look. Okay, I think we're all set. All right, thanks everybody.